Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all in today's program, The Decade of Restoration, What Lies Ahead for India's Ecosystems. The chair for today's program is Dr. Ravina Agrawal.
Welcome, everybody. It is wonderful to be here discussing such an important issue, and we're really delighted to have the speakers that we do. So there's never been a more urgent need to revive our damaged ecosystems than now. If we take the case of India alone, over the last century, we've lost approximately 40% of our natural forests, 50% of our wetlands, and 50% of grasslands. A recent study published in Nature indicates that restoring as much as 15% of land in global priority areas could avoid 60% of expected extinctions and remove around a third of the extra carbon dioxide that has been pumped into the atmosphere. For India, scaling up ecosystem restoration activities assumes national importance, as India is one of the mega biodiverse countries of the world, accounting for nearly 8% of the recorded species, with 47,000 plant species and over 100,000 animal species. Yet with 18% of the global human population and 15% of the world's livestock, all within just 2.4% of the world's land area. With increasing threats of climate change further impacting the health of ecosystems, the window for healing and reversing the trend of degradation and biodiversity loss is becoming ever so small and challenging global development agencies to spearhead global movements and inspire a generation for restoration. The United Nations envisages this decade, 2021 to 2030, to be the decade for ecosystem restoration, with the mission of recruiting more and more stakeholders to understand the issues and science behind ecosystem loss and restoration and identify a clear role for them to contribute, because contribution is completely essential and urgent. I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, who's going to just present some opening remarks. So over to you, Ruth, and welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Ravina, for that nice introduction. And thanks to you and the Center for organizing this event around such an incredibly important topic. There could not be a more important topic than ecosystem restoration at this time. I'll make some comments to frame the presentations and the discussions that we'll have during the session. Here we are at the beginning of the decade of ecosystem restoration. So we can look forward to meaningful action, changes on the ground, and healthier ecosystems for people and for nature. Ecosystem restoration is so critical at this juncture. It's the opportunity to take positive steps on multiple intertwined crises. One of those crises is the climate crisis, where we need, as humanity, learn to live with an uncertain climate, and we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A second crisis that Ravina mentioned is the biodiversity crisis, where we know we are losing species rapidly. We need to create the habitat and reverse the decline of the species, all species, and those species that we depend on so critically for food and for other services from our ecosystems. And a third crisis that we don't often put in the same list of crises is the livelihood and equality crisis, where there are millions and millions of people and young people who need to look to the future for meaningful employment, for jobs, for dignity, for life opportunities, and particularly in rural populations, we are facing a crisis in livelihood opportunities. All of these three crises are especially acute in India, relevant around the world, and especially in India. We know that India is a hotspot of vulnerability to climate change. India lives and breathes by the monsoon, and so many people are dependent directly on ecosystems for food, for energy, for so many needs. And what's so important about ecosystem restoration is to build resilience into ecosystems for what we face in increasing temperatures, in variability in the monsoon, and how key this restoration and resilience is to a healthy future. On the mitigation side, we know that India is not responsible for historical emissions and is not where the emissions came from that led to the current climate crisis. But we do know that that energy demands will continue to increase in India as standards of living rise, and emissions will necessarily increase. So the ability to use ecosystems to reduce emissions and sequester carbon is also a part of dealing with the climate crisis. And that need is embedded in India's nationally determined contributions to the UN climate process. So that's another important aspect of ecosystem restoration. And the biodiversity crisis hits hard in India. As Ravina said, India is incredibly one of the world's 17 megadiversity countries, and wildlife and biodiversity persists despite the immense human pressures on the small amount of land. It is a marvel and achievement and testament to the culture and to priorities that the biodiversity persists in India as it does. And we need to look to ecosystem restoration to continue to provide that habitat and to reverse the biodiversity crisis. With livelihoods and equality also very acute in India. India, as we all know, has a relatively young population that is looking for employment opportunities, 70% of the population being rural, meaning many people depend on agriculture for livelihoods. With climate change and economic conditions, agriculture is increasingly precarious with land degradation as well. And ecosystem restoration is critical to providing the healthy soil, the healthy diversity, the healthy ecosystems that can make agriculture resilient and a reliable source of employment and dignity for livelihoods and the millions of people that will be looking for these opportunities currently and in the future, looking to these opportunities in the future. What's so exciting about ecosystem restoration is that it goes beyond talk. It goes beyond identifying the importance of ecosystem restoration and into the nitty-gritty work, getting hands dirty, making real change in real places. We're going to hear about some of that work, which is making an impact on the ground. There are so many ecosystems that have been degraded from overuse, from agrochemicals, from pressure from livestock, and those ecosystems can come back to life with restoration, with devoted attention. And that's what the life's work of the people on this call is dealing with. So restoration occurs one place at a time, one community at a time. It requires knowledge of ecology, requires knowledge of social needs of the place, and it leads to real action and healthier ecosystems for people and for nature. So the work of the people on the panel today is so impressive and so critical to a healthy future. I want to thank them for their work and for getting their hands dirty and for taking positive steps with real action to overcome the intertwined crises of this century And again, thanks to the Center for organizing this panel and for all the work that you are doing on this important topic. And there could not be a more important topic. So with those comments, back to you.
Thank you, Columbia Global Center of Mumbai, for inviting me in this very important panel discussion. My presentation will focus on terrestrial ecosystems, especially forest ecosystems of India, and how we need to see ecological restoration from a very important angle and perspective. So this will be shared in my presentation. So deforestation, forest degradation, and massive loss of biodiversity is something very relevant that my previous speakers have also stressed upon. And if I talk about global statistics, about 75% of terrestrial environment is already severely altered. And the mega drivers are climate change, land use, land degradation, and both direct and indirect drivers, as mentioned by IPBES Global Assessment Report that was released in 2019, that has stressed that human actions are actually accelerating the way how climate change is shaping up our planet. So urbanization, mining, change in land use, these are all important drivers that are shaping up our ecosystems, especially forest ecosystems. And it has led to almost 30% reduction in global terrestrial habitat integrity. So there is massive habitat loss and deterioration of habitats. But recently released report by Chatham House in 2021 February stressed that global food systems with agriculture alone can be considered the mega driver, one of the important drivers that is leading to extinction of about 86% of species. Now, 1970 onwards, there has been about 300% of increase in food crop production. And this is also because of, to fulfill the demands, the nutritional and food security demands of the massive population rise that is been seen in last few decades. And there has been also almost reduced productivity from these agricultural land, that's about 23% due to land degradation. If I talk about India, there is excessive cultivation, soil erosion, and deforestation as mega drivers of land degradation. Now, it's very important to understand the way we were doing agriculture earlier and the kind of agriculture that we are doing now is very different. We are pumping a lot of chemical fertilizers, persistent organic pollutants, and also intensive use of and dependency on groundwater is leading to other related loss of water resources and biodiversity that my forthcoming speaker of this panel will discuss. I should not miss to also mention that socioeconomics and demographic trends are heavily influencing the consumption patterns that we are seeing now. And this has subsequent environmental implications. I'll take this very important example from Western Himalayas, where a lot of my work has focused in last almost 1.5 decades. If you see the kind of socioeconomic poverty that is resulting on excessive pressure on remotest and one of the most fragile ecosystem in mountains, be it alpine ecosystem or moist temperate forest ecosystem, there has been a tremendous increase in this pressure, be it for cordyceps, that's called Kira Jadi and has a lot of demand in Chinese markets, or lichen trade. There is this excessive demand that has influenced consumption patterns and dependency on these natural resources for livelihood. So this is also shaping up the forest ecosystem, but unfortunately, we are not giving any serious understanding and research to this important driver. So while forest degradation, deforestation will lead to calamities, a lot of vulnerability and increasing disaster risk for Himalayan ecosystem, and it will also reduce flow of a lot of ecosystem services that are required for subsistence, livelihood, and lifestyle of local people. It will actually enhance human drudgery. It will also lead to other socio-ecological issues like affecting the education, health, and social environment. So now when I talk about national and international policies and what are the programmatic challenges for India? India joined Bond Challenge, that's for forest landscape restoration in 2015, with a pledge that almost 13 million hectares of degraded lands will be restored by 2020 and additional 8 million hectares by 2030. So that means almost 21 million hectares were promised. But later on in a Delhi declaration of COP meeting by UNCCD in 2019, India further increased its target to 26 million hectares. Now, this is one of the biggest targets that India has proposed for the entire Asia. And if I see the nationally determined contribution that India has committed to, this also means that India has to create a carbon sink of about 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent from forest areas and tree cover. Again, this all is going to come from forest. And if you see the kind of forest right now India is having, that's very different than what Champion and State has given in 1968. Now our forest areas are more degraded. A lot of climatic climax forests are no more climatic climax, and we have more cereal stage forests in the country. And if I talk about the flagship programs of Government of India, there are a lot of efforts by Government of India at all levels. The National Afforestation Program or National Mission for a Green India, National Biodiversity Action Plan, and of course, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme and National Rural Livelihood Mission. They all are contributing to fulfilling the promises of India to achieve the restoration targets. Now, one of the important aspects of this entire slide is that whereas India has almost 29.32% of land that is degraded, while our restoration targets are only 5% of for restoration. Now, there is a huge gap if you see. So there has to be more efforts at all levels to actually fill this gap of almost 28.3% of degraded land to be restored in future. One of the important aspects is also that India has been forerunner in having its national agroforestry policy in 2014. Now, India has a special focus outside forest areas, outside natural forest areas, and these are tree outside forest. Agroforestry is one of the important traditional practice. Apart from the urban forest areas, avenue plantations, parks, horticulture, and all those types. So this is a very important step if I consider talking about tree outside forest. And India is trying to simplify the strict rules against felling and transporting trees that were considered a barrier for farmers to grow trees in their farmlands. There is still a long way to go when we talk about agroforestry policy and realizing the benefits on ground. But this is a great step taken at country level. And this is further strengthened by SARCOPA, the South Asian Regional Cooperation for Agroforestry Policies. So getting influenced and motivated by India's agroforestry policy, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, some of them have already developed their agroforestry policy. So this is a great step. And now there will be a lot more efforts on ground. One of the areas is corporate social responsibility mechanism, inviting the corporates and private funders to identify funding and include this funding for agroforestry research and agroforestry-based restoration practices. Now, still there are a lot of challenges for restoration to have success on ground. If I talk about global challenges, monitoring has been considered a very important, not only at global level, but also at country level, where we do a lot of plantation, but how to monitor what is the success rate at ground. Then financing restoration implementation, still a lot of money to restoration is coming from public funding schemes. And then involving a lot of people, different stakeholders. Dr. Ruth has already mentioned about a lot of people who are young, a lot of people who require livelihood. So connecting people, identifying areas where there can be more incentives to strengthen people's involvement, community involvement, intergenerational involvement in restoration is something that will be very relevant to see. Now, the State of Finance for Nature report has already highlighted that there needs to be almost triple investments in nature-based solutions by 2030 and 4 times by 2050 if we are actually very serious for resolving the planetary crisis of land degradation. And then public funding, as I mentioned, is almost 86% that is coming to restoration and conservation of nature and natural resources. But there is a long way and there is more need from private sector finances and engagement to significantly scale up. Now, as mentioned by my previous speaker also, there is a need of a lot of multidisciplinary and diverse group of researchers and different diverse group of stakeholders to get involved in restoration. It should not be considered a responsibility of government, forest department, but there are a lot of academic organizations, a lot of different researchers, women, communities, youth, indigenous communities, they should be part of this restoration effort. Now, if I would like to highlight couple of challenges for sustainable land restoration in India. I think one of the most important is lack of multi-criteria optimization approach to identify priority areas for restoration. We know a larger part of the country is degraded, has a degraded land. But at the same time, we need to understand that a lot of high-value ecosystems, your mega biodiversity centers in Eastern Himalayas, your islands in Western Ghats are also getting degraded very fast because of a lot of developmental projects, agriculture, horticulture, and so on and so forth. So like Rome in Bond Challenge, the monitoring approach should be, kind of multi-criteria optimization approach should be developed for the country as well to identify our finances, the government funding, where should be the priority to invest and how it should be used. Then in last few decades, of course, we have developed a lot of good understanding on species structure, but we are still not very sure about what are their functions and what are the socio-ecological interlinkages, what are the ecological succession patterns for different biogeographic zones. So that's where the academicians, the scientists, the ecologists, the botanists, they can play a very important role. Now, one of the important issues is also that we try to implement similar kind of solution to different agroclimatic zone, to different biogeographic zone, planting similar kind of species that are fast growing and high biomass yielding. Then lack of people-centric approach. We still don't consider indigenous local knowledge systems that have been gathered for last so many decades and hundreds of years to be part of this restoration program. And that's very important to be included. A shortage of legislation and policy, especially the ones that can incentivize ecological or ecosystem restoration by communities. Convergence is one of the important area. We lack a lot of coordination among various government line departments, agriculture, integrated watershed management, forest department, they all are working on so many similar tasks, but there is a lot of lack of coordination, and hence the funding goes to different departments without having a kind of convergence to implement these solutions. Monitoring is again an important area. Monitoring post-plantation care and insufficient long-term research. There has been a lot of forest department doing a lot of research, a lot of plantation in different states, but how are we actually using this long-term database, the big data that is being generated by forest department? So we don't have enough scientific outputs on them. So we developed this climate-sensitive restoration planning, and I was very pleased to see in one of the meetings with Maharashtra Forest Department that they are actually using a lot of artificial intelligence, the citizen science approach, and drone-based monitoring to do post-plantation, post-restoration monitoring, their restoration and plantation. But what has been still lacking in the planning phase is involvement of communities, involvement of local people in understanding what should be planted, where it should be planted, and why it should be planted. Researchers, their involvement and using modeling tools, I think that can be a big game changer to this entire restoration implementation program. And then implementation phase, how we link commercial enterprises to support sustainable land restoration, how we involve communities in mass propagation of indigenous species, how we involve them in land preparation and plantation so that they can also earn livelihood benefits. So these are some of the areas that we try to explore that can ensure that our restoration efforts are more climate sensitive and have more successful outcomes.
So from forests to wetlands, I think my task has been made much easier by Shalini, unpacking the finer nuances of restoration. And so this presentation would be largely about wetlands, where much of my work has been. When we talk about wetlands, in major global processes, we end up lumping them either into land or water. You can see those lumpiness in Aichi targets and global biodiversity targets and so on, wherein several assessments have indicated that wetlands may be the hotspots of ecological degradation and might need specific attention. And secondly, much of my realization now is that restoration, at least in Indian context or in South Asian context, is less a problem of science. Rather, we need to get our act together on the policy and governance dimensions. It is more about how we decide, how do we take action on science rather than the science itself, which is very loud and clear. on what is happening. So globally, natural wetlands are on a decline. When we did the Global Wetlands Outlook in 2018, we established a global evidence base on the systems, on the way wetlands are behaving. This is an index on wetlands in India constructed using over 300 data points from natural as well as human-made wetlands. And this trend nearly replicates the global observations. Is the natural wetlands, which is the green line below, is on a continuous decline, wherein wetlands that have been made by human action, including barrages, dams, waterlogged areas, are on an increase. So we are changing the character of the asset that we have. And naturally, Aditya, next slide. These, when we try to unpack the degradation drivers, I'm just showing you again, from a sample of over 300 wetlands, we look at several drivers of changes, and these drivers are not uniform. Apparently, I'm re-emphasizing Shalini's point that a one-size-fits-all approach might not work. However, in coast, what we have is challenges around sediment and water quality, where in Himalayan wetlands, we are more looking at challenges related to solid waste. So the degradation drivers, and I'm still talking about direct drivers of change, are very much differentiated across Indian wetlands. Over last 25 years that I've been working, I've seen the narrative of wetland restoration changing, and it's a real positive thing. So in 90s, when Siberian cranes stopped coming to India, to Bharatpur in particular, it made news headlines. These populations were possibly extirpated due to hunting pressure. There was a small population here, Mongolia, Myanmar, Mongolia, that used to come to India, and it stopped coming. And that became the wetland crisis story, was a crisis of species and habitat. When I look at newspapers, and the way wetlands are being discussed is more about water. So last couple of years back, when Chennai had to take a train to bring water to the city, to the parched city, I could see now people realize the value of wetlands. And these are all, snippets taken from the newspapers. So today, it is after Chennai floods. The headlines speak of Chennai losing its wetlands and thereby not able to store excess water and being flooded. Or, this story repeats in most of the mega cities, and especially these cities are also the hubs of economic development. So a storyline which began around habitats and species is now shifting close to being a crisis of water, a crisis of pollution. So essentially now what we are seeing is wetlands loss is no longer just a conservation challenge, but is a development crisis, and that reflects in parched waters, in increasing droughts. And now it is much closer home. It is no longer about esoteric species which come all the way from the cold temperate regions to India. It is also about the basic sustenance of humans that is now in question. So amongst the wetland loss data that we've been seeing, what we have been able to pinpoint that urban wetlands have possibly seen a far higher rate of accelerated degradation than the other parts of the landscape. Data that my team has dug up from nearly 70 odd cities shows that for every 1 square kilometer increase in built up area, we have lost nearly 25 hectares of wetlands. So one part of the storyline is the rapid loss of urban wetlands. But what we are also seeing is that restoration pathways are seemingly becoming very different. Normally, one would expect, and what we have been championing is restoring healthy catchments to restore a wetland ecosystem, because if the catchments are healthy, wetlands also perform well. But with increased urbanization, there is also a challenge of sewage. And with only 1/3 of sewage, at least on papers, being treated, these sewage are ending up into wetlands. So it is not just a question of wetland being degraded. Wetlands are now in the urban landscape being seen as a place to park treated sewage, the volumes of which are so unsurmountable that we will need possibly to create more wetlands to store these, or at least nature would create ones. And several of the restoration stories that I see today are basically quick fix solutions to divert treated sewage or sometimes even untreated sewage to a wetland to claim that water levels have been restored and species would like to inhabit these wetlands. Pollution has been a long-term driver of wetland degradation, but there are new pollutants. Unfortunately, we are not geared to treat antibiotic residues, for example, in rivers and wetlands, or even microplastics and macroplastics. And again, our pollution treatment systems, or even the science backing them, possibly was looking at a different set of pollutants, chemical pollutants. But today, with macroplastics, microplastics, and range of other pollutants, I think we are looking at a different animal altogether, which needs a new coordinated effort of behavior change education and possibly trying to contain the problem at source rather than working at end of pipeline solutions. Climate, again, is the elephant in the room. When I look at wetland management, several of our plans were written characterizing the wetland as in the 70s or 60s, or what British colonial surveys would allow us to, permit characterization of the wetland, and trying to build solutions around those to ensure that those regimes are established. The climate science and downscale models tell us that, situation is no longer going to be same. I'm showing one of the simulation exercises that we did on hydrology of Chilika Lagoon. And you can apparently see that it is not just the temperatures, but overall water balance. And the flux of water that defines how a wetland functions are going to change. It also means that we are looking, or we are, the stationarity-led management approaches, which characterizes much of management, wetland management till date, is highly likely to be insufficient going into the future. But what is less recognized in climate mitigation and adaptation discussions is the role of peatlands. Peatlands, high carbon value wetlands, locked up mostly in the Himalayas, which have the potential to significantly address the carbon mitigation ambitions of the government. And also with increasing temperatures, land use change, grazing pressure, at the risk of being huge sources of carbon if not managed well. This is a current assessment that my team is doing in the Himachal Pradesh, wherein we could locate a very healthy patch of peatland just embedded beyond one of the Ramsar sites. There is a need to critically invest into peatland distribution in India and accordingly retrofit our carbon mitigation targets. So thereby, one of the major challenges going ahead for wetlands management is to embrace, uncertainty. Look at wetlands. We are used to, in much of the environmental planning, preparing plans which look into 10 years or even deeper into 20 years. With wetlands, unfortunately, our realization is that these systems are far more dynamic, far more sensitive to climate change, and thereby may need much more closer monitoring and shifting of policies and programs as may be the situation. So we need to be realistic about uncertainty, admit the fact that the future is likely to be uncertain, but also close monitoring of these ecosystems may be the best way to be able to adjust management, and thereby, and also blending conservation of healthy wetlands with, gray infrastructure to arrive at the best combination of gray and green infrastructure to address climate change-induced extreme events. One of the critical things beyond science is about how do we talk about wetlands, how do we understand science. In one, to just show you an example of how things get complicated, and I was looking at a Ramsar site at a wetland of international importance, which had problem of high silt coming into it. When I looked at the civil engineers, their logic was pretty simple: reduce the flow, reduce silt, and the wetland system is going to be longer. When you talk to the farmers, they said floods are not actually a problem. They bring silt and they ensure ecosystem is more productive. The problem is not floods, but what we do to contain these floods by creating more embankments. But the science base here is anecdotal. by experience and not measured in the same metrics as an engineer would love to. And when you talk to an ecologist, he's somewhere in between, saying that these flood pulses are what induces migration and species behavior and change. So all of these are three different epistemologies and knowledge systems, and there is always a perpetual challenge of getting over the silos of narrow scientific training, data generation that we have around wetlands and other ecosystems, and identify solutions that are more bridging and connecting rather than perpetuating a single siloed approach.
I welcome everyone who's joining online for this, as Ruth called it earlier, as a very important topic that we must discuss and take action on. So without much ado, let me sort of start with what we are dealing with as an issue, which was described first by Ruth and then certainly expanded upon by Dr. Dhyani in looking at forest ecosystems, and then after that by Dr. Kumar in looking at wetland ecosystems. I think throughout what you'll find a clear agreement on when it comes to ecological restoration is that there's no one size fits all. Community demands, requirements, the social and the ecological context will define what these solutions will be on the ground. So therefore, we are dealing with a heterogeneous system for which we will need a suite of answers. It cannot be one silver bullet answer for everything. And therefore, when one talks about scaling, when one talks about how to address this problem of degradation, which has come up from these heterogeneous sources, but in scale it has become a homogeneous problem of degradation, how do we actually think in terms of scaling heterogeneity? And for that purpose, I think we need to look across certain disciplinary boundaries, as Dr. Kumar was saying. We need to look at uncertainty, as he was also emphasizing. And we also need to try and see what are the ways in which we can scale different problems for different contexts in ways that address those local solutions on the ground. We know that while there are many scaled governmental programs in India and elsewhere, that one size fits all, whether it's afforestation or whether it's soil restoration of different kinds and so on, that one size fits all just won't work. So I think from a scientific and a socio-economic standpoint, it's important to sort of take that and accept it and make sure that we move forward from there. So one of the areas that we've been looking at the Ashoka Trust in Research in Ecology and the Environment, ATRE, has been to look at ecological restoration and the role that biodiversity plays in that. Biodiversity by its own nature means that you're dealing with diverse ecosystems, and yet you must deal with principles that enable you to handle systems at scale. And so how do you actually think through that? And that's something that we've been looking at. What this requires, though, is that we cross our disciplinary boundaries to come up with innovations. And so what I'm going to speak about today is some of the work that we are doing in what's called the Alliance for Reversing Ecosystem Service Threats, or ARREST, as a program that we are running across multiple institutions, where we are trying out some innovative mechanisms by which we may be able to think about ecological restoration at scale. So while we were looking at India as a whole, we chose to look at what Dr. Dhyani also described as focusing in on large landscapes or ecoregions, as they were. So we focused in India on essentially what's in and around the Deccan Plateau, which is the semi-arid and the subhumid zones of India. We mapped all these areas in as much detail as we could. And the idea is, how can we prioritize restoration by embracing the fact that these are complex socio-ecological systems? And when we identified these agroecological and jurisdictional boundaries, we found that, in fact, they are primarily these two zones in peninsular India. We also focused on areas which are outside the protected areas, focusing on commons and private lands, because those are the larger areas outside the smaller protected areas, which Dr. Dhyani spoke about so nicely. And then within those areas, we found that there were three predominant types of ecosystems that we needed to focus on when it came to what were already degraded ecosystems or degraded lands. They were degraded agricultural lands, open natural ecosystems, and riparian habitats. And when we actually mapped these using remote sensing methods and other ground truthing data that we had available, what we found was a substantial amount of area was available as, in a conservative way, as 13 million hectares of land that could be included for restoration, out of which almost 11 million hectares were in agricultural land or are in agricultural land, about 1 million hectares in riparian habitats, and about 1 million hectares in open natural ecosystems, which includes grasslands, scrublands, and so on, which are often mischaracterized as wastelands, which is a complete misnomer and a mischaracterization of their ecological and socio-ecological value. But those 13 million hectares do not include, actually, lands that are degraded, as Ruth was saying, due to over-fertilization. They are degraded due to salt intrusion, and so on. So we feel that the 13 million hectares, which is half of India's land degradation target, just in peninsular India, those 13 million hectares are actually an underestimate of what is available, and that can be addressed by ecological restoration. When we actually characterize this for the global climate meet in Glasgow, we found that at least 25% of our NDC3, which is for sequestration, could be addressed directly through this restoration, through above ground and below ground carbon sequestration that we are looking at. India's target, as Dr. Dhyani mentioned, is almost 2.5 to 3 billion tons, which is a very large target, but a substantial amount can be addressed by this 13 million hectares alone. Now, by aggregating these lands into these kinds of landscapes and ecosystems, we could then think about a limited set of options that could be applied in terms of restoration techniques to those particular situations. In order to do that further, we wanted to come up with metrics for detecting and for measuring what that land degradation was about. There are various definitions of degradation from IUCN to UNCCD and so on. We picked a number of variables. Again, the more details are available, and I'll share a website with you. I'll encourage you to look at those details and the data sets, which are open. So we would be happy to share them. And a multitude of variables and indicators applied to estimate what that land degradation looks like. Broadly speaking, it includes areas which can be characterized either as browning or greening areas by applying NDVI mapping and looking at water erosion and water and soil erosion as the primary causal elements for the degradation that we are looking at. There are others. As I said, this is not a complete estimate. This is an underestimate, a conservative estimate, I might add, of what's available for restoration in just this area alone. What this helped us do is it helped us focus. It helps us focus into areas where we can actually prioritize sites for pilots. And as you can see in some of the charts over there, we are heading in that direction. And where we show the significant potential for focusing efforts for restoration. One of the ways in which one can look at this is to determine a multi-optimization model, as Dr. Dhyani was mentioning. At the same time, we also feel that these challenges require a certain amount of innovation, like the example that she provided about using local means for, say, slope stabilization or what have you, to to come up with local solutions. So what are the real challenges needed? I think all three speakers spoke about what needs to be done to actually take action. A lot of our problems, as Dr. Kumar said, are related to policy and governance that leads to action. So therefore, the ARREST team looked at the institutional governance alternatives for such a scalable approach to restoration. That includes certainly data-related work, which includes mapping of these institutional structures to understand what their budgetary allocations are, how their financial flows actually work, how their governance mechanisms are actually in place and can be in place. The second is how you can actually use dynamic tools which employ systems thinking, including things such as systems dynamics modeling and social network mapping, which will enable us to actually characterize the situation and come up with methods of localized solutions which can still be scaled. And lastly, for implementation, what are the institutional mechanisms, whether they are the biodiversity management committees or Manrega schemes or Gram Panchayats, which allow for participatory governance for such local interventions for ecological restoration. So a couple of key things that have emerged from this analysis, and again, all the data and a lot of the details are on the website, which I'll share with you in a moment. But two main things is that if we have to have community engagement, which is a must, based on local aspirations and local demands, then we must look at a people-centric approach where the interventions are driven by demand, so that we're not pushing solutions onto situations, but we are actually deriving solutions based on local demand. And I think the demand-sided approach, rather than the supply-sided approach, is very important, because otherwise previous experience, whether it's in the wasteland restorations efforts or whether it was in the watershed development efforts and so on, show that a solutions orientation or a supply-sided solutions orientation may sometimes not find the uptake and the participation at the local level because inherently there was no demand for it. So therefore, a demand-sided approach is something that we are focusing on. And secondly, in order to understand demand, you must understand the community aspirations. And so a number of our efforts are socio-ecological in nature, in terms of actually identifying what are the community aspirations to ensure that there is demand for it and that therefore there will be sustainability of the projects that result. So what are the innovations that are needed? We need catalysts, we need collaborations, and ultimately it has to lead to finance, because that finance will actually mobilize something, and finance occurs at scale. We have to acknowledge that. So when we scale heterogeneity and when we scale for finance, what all do we need to do in terms of innovations that need to be brought to the table so that we can actually get to action? I don't think these issues are unknown to the community in terms of what the challenges are. The question is what will work at scale. And so one of the first things that, of course, we need to look at is, as some of the speakers have spoken earlier, is to bring together the key stakeholders, both government and civil society, for coordination and collaboration. And there are different mechanisms that exist to do that. The second is to actually look at what finance is there and what finance is available. And you'll find in the data in our website that, in fact, the government is spending a fair amount of resources through their public finance schemes, as you can analyze through the union and the state budgets of the Finance Commission and CAMPA and so on, all the programs, that there are, in fact, many schemes, but it's almost as if the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. I think it's really important to think about these in a mission mode, in a way in which we can actually target them and repurpose them and repackage them so that we have a common objective of restoring our ecosystems. In fact, our estimate shows that our transition cost to get from our degraded state today to a repurposed state, a restored state, with a transition period of about 6 years, the requirements are somewhere close to about 235 lakh crores over 6 years, about 40,000 crores per year. And interestingly enough, a large amount of the activities that are funded, say soil restoration, which exists across many ministries and departments. In fact, if they are repurposed properly, a lot of that finance exists. And lastly, we need to complement this with private sector investments. So what we are looking for is how do we actually expand the agricultural value chain and other restoration activities so that we can finance at scale the specific causes of restoration, such as soil erosion, microbiome loss, and invasive species. And with that, I just wanted to thank everyone for giving me the opportunity here to present the work that we are doing under this very exciting program in ARREST. The partners here, which are noted, including the World Agroforestry Center, or ICRAF, Columbia University, the Environmental Defense Fund, and the Foundation for Ecological Security, for working together with ATRI on this alliance that we've created over the past couple of 3 years.
Thank you to all the speakers. I'm going to open the floor to questions. I'll start with a few of my own, and then please feel free, audience, to pose your questions. And so I'll start with Dr. Dhyani. So Shalini, this is for you. So looking at this goal of achieving 33% of the land under forest in a country like ours, how realistic is this target?
I think as per my experience and understanding goes, I think with reference to the restoration targets that country has already promised at different Bonn Challenge or UNCCD or through the NDCs, I think this looks very much that needs to be achieved to the time that has been proposed. But at the same time, I think this also looks for opportunities outside forest areas. Looking beyond natural forest to tree outside forest areas. I'm sure we all are convinced that most of these natural forest areas are getting open and more open as the development is progressing, as our energy demands are rising. We need more coal, we need more power, energy to run this country and fulfill the demands of the increasing population of the country. So at this particular time, I think this definitely is one of the challenging targets, but I'm sure if the right policies are there, right strategies are there, there are opportunities that if not 33%, at least somewhere closer to that target. And if we talk about climate justice, if we talk about the recent Glasgow discussions that happen and how the country is projected at international level, I think these kind of targets and the way they are projected through the Panchamrit, how Prime Minister of India has promised at global level. I think this looks a little challenging, but I'm sure there are opportunities, there are options. I'm sure if these ideas are mainstreamed, there are a lot of opportunities for coming decade. And I'm sure India will be able to reach somewhere closer to this target of 33%. If not in natural areas, I'm sure outside the forest, natural forest areas.
Speaking about that, speaking about the natural forest areas versus going outside that. So if we think of promoting trees through avenue plantations or the green belt or urban parks, do you think of it as a socio-economically and environmentally well-evaluated policy choice? Or is it a no alternative? We don't have any alternative policy choice.
I think you have very rightly pointed out, and I'm sure there are a lot of case studies and examples, not only WRI, but also our own organization have provided a lot of studies where it's very clear that natural forests are better ecosystems. They give you better ecosystem services. They can store more carbon in soil and biomass. But at the same time, we cannot ignore these plantations. Somehow or some way or other, they have to be part of this, the way this system and the forests are changing in this warming world. This plantation will take place. This has started somewhere during the social forestry program of the country in early 60s. And now so we are seeing the kind of evidence, like how they are different in the natural forest areas. So judicious choice of species, right compositions, with the understanding the climates of the areas can definitely play a big role. I think it's all driven by community demands. We cannot say that people don't want tree outside forest areas. If I talk about the urban area, especially my work in Nagpur and Faridabad, the NCR area, I think there is a lot of demand-supply gap if you talk about blue-green infrastructure in these urban areas. So if you talk about WHO guidelines or UNEP guidelines for urban areas, there is a huge demand-supply gap. And that is where people think that they're not getting enough of green spaces and blue spaces that they are entitled to. And this is also clear through the participatory surveys that we have tried to do in these areas. That's also the basic social requirement of people. And a right to environment is also something that we need to understand in this context. So I think, yes, it's not a no alternative choice. It's a requirement for the country. So be it a good avenue plantation, roadside plantation, or buffer plantations on railway lines, it's not only to target the NDCs of the country, but to identify whatever possibilities are there to plant, to restore. And I think this is also what Dr. Pandit has stressed on when we talk about innovations, identifying the areas in riparian buffers, identifying areas where they can be planted. And that's one of the most ignored areas when we talk about plantation. And we wrongly term them as wastelands and ecosystems or lands that are of no value. So I think this is a proper judicious choice. And I'm happy that India is already thinking in that direction, where undervalued ecosystems, the tree outside forest, not only the horticulture models or bamboo models, but also understanding what people want in their urban areas, what people want in their agroforestry system, and giving them right to raise them, to sell them, and earn the livelihood. I think it's a well-planned and a well-thought-out strategy to comply with the international standards and also ensure human well-being for the larger population of the country.
Thank you. That was very, very, very informative and certainly a very important perspective. My next question is for Dr. Kumar. India, of course, has a large number of wetlands, used 4% of the country's area, but only 47 of these are included in the Ramsar Convention. And very few of them have, less than half have any management plan. So why is this management planning lagging behind, and what is lost by not having management planning done in these other sites?
Thank you for this very pertinent question. Though we just have 47 wetlands, in terms of area, nearly, I think, 8 to 10% of our known wetland regime. I still am sure that our wetland regime, known wetland regime, is a gross underestimate. Is under the international network of wetlands. The larger question that we need to ask is, does notifying a wetland as a Ramsar site make any difference? Like, you put a flag to a building and say it is heritage. If you don't do something about it, that's a larger question. And what we have seen, unfortunately, and there is a serious lag in our commitment and action on the ground. By designating a site to the Wetlands of International Importance Network, unwritten commitment is to ensure wise use. That means we maintain the biodiversity, we maintain the natural status, and meeting that commitment has been a challenge due to various reasons. So you're coming to the second question on why management planning fails. India is unfortunately not a land of large wetlands. If you look carefully at the wetland distribution data, though the remote sensing did not allow the mappers to permit below the 2.56 hectare threshold, which has now become an iconic number because everybody talks about 2.56, 30 by 30 meter resolution. That is what the satellites permit you to map. But 80% of known wetland regime is below that. So India is not a land of large wetlands, and management plans are essentially an instrument to manage large complex systems. When you don't have an agreement, when the wetlands span several jurisdictions, you need to have a common agreement. And that was where the natural progression of wetland historically in Europe, America, has been to look at these large iconic systems planned through multiple sectors. But suddenly, satellite data tells you that you are in land of small wetlands, village ponds, in several forms, tanks, in urban systems, anyways. So, does management plan, is it still an instrument fit for purpose? I doubt. It can work well for large systems, multi-jurisdictional systems. What we need today is more, sector plans which are sensitive to wetlands. So today, much more money is flowing outside these management plans, which influence wetlands. For example, rural employment schemes, which allow people to dig wetlands in the name of desiltation, create jobs, or afforestation programs. When we go for targets like billion trees, and do a mapping where these trees have been planted. Now, wetlands are places where you have moisture, and unfortunately, there are state-funded programs for, putting trees where they should not be. I'm examining some data sets in Ganges, in certain Gangetic states, and to my surprise, the biggest driver today is an afforestation program which has been ill-informed on where to plant. Right. So what we need today is to influence sectors. It is less about what wetland management does or the instrument by which you influence wetland. It is more about an urban plan which should not pour concrete into wetlands in the name of beautification. I see that all around Bangalore, for example. Beautiful wetlands, concretized wetlands, shoreline, promenades, whatnot. Now, these are the things that we need to influence, and they need instruments which are different than hyper complicated management plans, which need a lot of science, a lot of investment into stakeholder building. But the reality is also on the institutional side. There is a lot of institutional arthritis all around. The business as usual of siloed approaches, it just refuses to change. 25 years and I'm still struggling to see a good implemented management plan. What we need is ecologically sensitive, wetland sensitive sector programs rather than highly super complicated science driven management agendas. Very well required. Definitely I don't discount them.
Yeah.
I see the real challenge of replicating management plans in 0.77 million wetlands in the country. Unthinkable. We need different instruments.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very, very important point that you're raising about the silos and and half the problem, it seems, is won by just not pouring concrete. So that's half the problem one, and the rest of it is, also looking at this in an actionable manner. So in terms of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, and this is for Dr. Pandit, how do you see this panning out? What are your hopes for this decade? How do you see, this becoming something that, can really be actionable?
I agree with Dr. Kumar that it's important to identify these targets, to identify the larger goals and objectives of countries and societies, because we are dealing with impacts at that scale also. But I think if anything, if the decade here is able to sensitize us to the fact that the solutions are local solutions, that they are driven by demand at the local levels. Mm-hmm. And therefore, as Dr. Kumar said, the instruments for delivery are very, very different from what you would look at as sort of I use the term again, but top-down solutions where just because you can you can look at the impact at a large scale, that means you tend to assume that it's a solution at a large scale. Mm-hmm. And it is scaling heterogeneity that is at the core of what we must look at. And so if we are able to even sensitize people through that, demonstrate examples of how one can actually look at a system of heterogeneous solutions that can be institutionally scaled together, mm-hmm. not necessarily technically scaled together, but institutionally scaled together, so that the instruments that are available in what Lynn Ostrom would have called in a set of nested institutions which is where finance can be aggregated at a large scale for all of us who think that solutions are available and applicable at a local scale. I don't think you'll find anyone saying no to that. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that finance has to be done at a large scale. Mm-hmm. So we are dealing with a very basic issue of what is the level of aggregation of a particular set of problems and for which a particular set of solutions can be applicable. And that's why I think it's very important to use the science and the data to try and classify the problems so that you can actually understand the demand for a certain set of solutions first before we come in and say, put trees on everything. So I think so if we come in with a one size fits all, which is where I think you have to be careful about things. And I'd like to comment a little bit on the idea about forests being better sequesters of carbon, as an example. No question. Okay, I wish we had pristine forests all over, but we don't. Okay, so I think to say, therefore, that everything should look like a forest and everything should have a tree in it, even if it is a grassland or a riparian habitat and so on. I mean, briefly, I would say it's a beautiful theory, but spoiled by facts.
So how practical is restoring, when we think of restoration, how practical is restoring such wholescapes?
Well, I think there are I think if you look deeper into this at the right scale, if we are able to aggregate correctly, I think wholescapes, so the concept of wholescapes is not then just contiguous geographic areas. These are essentially conceptual aggregations of local actions which have the same kind of problem characteristics, and they have the same kind of demand, therefore, for the kind of solutions that are available out there and that can be developed. So I think what we need is an institutional structure that can respond to those kinds of wholescapes rather than, identifying just a large area and so on. You have to dig in to say, within those large areas, what are the kinds of wholescapes that exist, and for which, what are the institutional structures that are needed to deliver the kinds of solutions or a menu of solutions that can apply to those wholescapes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn over to you, Ruth, and see if you would like to add anything on this issue.
Well, first, thank you for those excellent, inspiring presentations to Dr. Pandit, Dr. Dhyani, and Dr. Kumar. Very inspiring. And I'll just want to circle back to one of the questions in the chat, which is, if ecosystem restoration is such an obvious way to build resilience and improve possibilities for rural and urban areas, why doesn't it happen? Why doesn't it get the investment and attention? And going back to the points made by Dr. Pandit, governments and private sector are very adept at silver bullet solutions, rolling out investments, and making things happen at a big scale. We see that over and over again around the world. What governments and private sector are not so adept at is doing the messy work, the complicated work, the time-intensive work to understand and support what is required at a local level, building on the demand that's coming from people who live in these places and are in a very strong position to know what types of restoration will be beneficial for them. So I see that as a challenge to us, to all of us, to build the demonstrations and methods and capabilities to be able to deal with that messiness and complexity in a way that can attract investment and can attract attention and recognition that this kind of more bottom-up approach is what will be beneficial in the long term. And I look at this as our challenge to build up that capability and show that this demand-driven, locally based kinds of ecosystem restoration is possible and is beneficial for climate resilience, for livelihoods, for all of these crises that we face. So again, I think we are exactly at time. Thank you to the Columbia Global Center in Mumbai, to Ravina, and all of the team at the Global Center for this very, very inspiring session.